In this fashion he lay for a very long time. Occasionally he seemed to wake up, and at such moments he would realise that it had been night for a long time now. Yet the idea of getting up never entered his head. At last he saw it was light, as good as daylight. He was lying flat out on the sofa, still paralysed by his recent loss of consciousness. What had reached him with the terrible, desperate cries from the street that he heard regularly every night under his window, some time after 2 o'clock? These it had been that had woken him up just now. Ah, that'll be the drunks coming out of the dens, he thought. It's gone 2 a.m. And suddenly he leapt up, as though someone had pulled him off the sofa. What? It's gone 2? He sat down on the sofa, and then it all came back to him. Suddenly, in a single flash, it all came back. For that initial second he thought he was going insane. A terrible coldness had seized him. But the coldness was also due to the fever which had begun within him a long time ago, while he had been asleep. Now he was suddenly attacked by an ague so violent that his teeth nearly leapt from his mouth, so violently did they chatter, and his entire body started to shake. He opened the door and began to listen. Everyone in the building was fast asleep. In amazement, he examined first himself, and then every aspect of the room, unable to comprehend how he could possibly have come in the evening before and not have set the door on its hook, but simply thrown himself on the sofa with all his clothes on, even his hat. It had rolled on the floor, where it lay near his pillow. If anyone had come in, what would they have thought? That I was drunk? But he rushed to the window. There was quite a lot of light now, and he quickly began to examine himself all over, from head to toe, all his clothes, to see if there were any marks. But he couldn't do it like that. Shaking with ague, he began to take off all his things and examine them thoroughly. He ransacked everything, right down to the last thread, the last scrap of cloth, and lacking confidence in himself, repeated the examination some 3 times. But it was all right. There seemed not to be any marks. Only his trouser ends, in the place where they'd hung down and rubbed on the ground, retained some thick traces of coagulated blood. He grabbed hold of his large folding knife and pared the rubbed ends. There seemed not to be anything else that required attention. Suddenly he remembered that the purse and the object he had stolen from the old woman's chest were all of them still in his pockets, and had been there all this time. It had taken him until now to think of removing them and hiding them away. He had not even remembered about them just then, as he had been examining his clothes. What was wrong with him? In an instant he fell on them, taking them out and hurling them on the table. When he had removed them all, even turning the pockets inside out in order to make sure there was nothing left in them, he carried the whole pile to the far corner of the room. There, right in the very corner down at the bottom, the wallpaper was torn in one place, where it had peeled away from the wall. He immediately began to cram everything into this hole, under the paper. In it went, all hidden from sight, the purse as well, he thought with relief, getting up on his knees and looking stupidly at the corner, with its hole that was now bulging out more than ever. Suddenly he recoiled in horror. "Good God," he whispered in despair, "what's the matter with me? Do you call that hidden? Are those things anywhere near hidden?" As a matter of fact, the discovery of those objects had not been a part of his calculations. He had supposed there'd only be money, and for that reason had not prepared a hiding place in advance. But now what have I got to laugh about, he thought. My sanity really is deserting me. In a state of utter exhaustion, he sat down on the sofa, and instantly an unbearable ague began to make him shake and shiver once more. Mechanically, he pulled towards him the old winter overcoat that was lying beside him on the chair. It was the overcoat he had had as a student, a warm one, but by this time it was in rags. He covered himself with it, and was at once embraced by sleep and delirium. He lost consciousness. Not more than about 5 minutes later, he leapt up again, and once more, in an instantaneous sudden frenzy, rushed over to his clothes. "How could I have fallen asleep again when nothing's been done? I knew it! I haven't even taken the loop out from under the armpit yet. I forgot it. I could forget a thing like that. A piece of incriminating evidence like that." He tugged the loop out and quickly began to tear it into shreds, stuffing them into the linen under his pillow. Some bits of torn canvas can't possibly arouse any suspicion. Surely not, he repeated, standing in the middle of the room and beginning to look around him again with a focus of attention that was intensified to the point of pain, surveying the floor and all the other parts of the room, in an agony lest he had forgotten something. A certainty that everything, even his memory, even the simple faculty of reason, was deserting him had begun to torment him unendurably. What, is it really beginning now? Is this the punishment beginning? Yes, I knew it. It was true. The parings of his trouser ends, which he had cut away, were strewn all over the floor, in the middle of the room, for the first person who walked in to observe. "What on earth's the matter with me?" he exclaimed again, like a lost soul. A strange thought suddenly came into his head. What if all his clothes were covered in blood? What if there were many stains, only he could not see them, could not find out where they were, because his reason had grown feeble, broken apart, his mind grown darkened? Suddenly he remembered that there had been blood on the purse too. That means there must be blood in my pocket too, because I shoved the purse into it while it was still wet. In a flash he turned out the pocket, and its lining discovered, as he had known he would, traces of blood, whole stains. That means my reason hasn't yet deserted me entirely. If I could remember and think of it on my own, it means I still have my wits about me, and my memory intact, he reflected in triumph, breathing a deep, joyful sigh with the whole of his lungs. It's just weakness brought on by my fever, the delirium of a moment, he told himself, as he ripped the lining away in its entirety from the left pocket of his trousers. At that moment, a ray of sunlight illuminated his left boot. On the sock that was peeping out through the crack at the front of the boot, he thought he saw marks. He kicked off his boots. Yeah, there are marks. The whole toe of the sock is saturated in blood. He must have stepped in that puddle without noticing at the time. But now what can I do about it? Where am I going to put this sock? The bits of my trouser ends, the pocket lining. He raked them all together in one hand and stood in the middle of the room. Should I hide them in the stove? But the stove's the first place they'll start rummaging about in. Burn them? What with? I don't even have any matches. No, I'd better take them somewhere outside and throw them away. Yes, the best thing to do is throw them away, he repeated, sitting down on the sofa again. And right now, this minute, without delay. Instead, however, his head sank back on the pillow again. Again the unendurable ague sent its icy chill through him. Again he pulled the overcoat about him, and for a long time, several hours, he kept telling himself in his dreams, "Come on, you must take the stuff right now and throw it all away out of sight somewhere, quickly, quickly." Several times he tried to get off the sofa and stand up, but was unable to. At last, a loud knock at the door woke him. "Come on, open up! You alive or dead? He's still snoozing," Nastasia shouted, beating her fist against the door. "Oh, days on end he snoozes like a hound dog. That's what he is, a hound dog. Open up, can't you? It's nearly 11 o'clock. "Perhaps he's not in," a man's voice said. Ah, the yard-keeper's voice. What's he want? He leapt up into a sitting position on the sofa. His heart was beating so violently that it actually hurt him. "Here, who's been setting the door on the hook?" Nastasia said in an affronted tone of voice. "Would you believe it? He's started locking himself in now. Is he scared they'll come and take him away? Or something like that? Open up, stupid head. Wakey, wakey." What do they want? Why is the yard-keeper there? They know everything. Should I put up a fight, open the door? I'd better open the door. I may as well take a chance. He raised himself on one elbow, leaned forward, and took the door off the hook. The entire room was of such dimensions that it was possible to take the door off the hook without getting off the bed. It was what he had supposed. Nastasia and the yard-keeper were standing there. For some reason he thought Nastasia was looking him over in a strange sort of way. He glanced at the yard-keeper with a challenging and desperate air. The yard-keeper silently extended towards him a grey, double-folded document sealed with bottle green sealing wax. "It's a summons," "From the bureau," he said, handing him the document. "What bureau?" "It means the police want to see you. It's their bureau. You know what bureau I mean." "The police? Why?" "Don't ask me. If they want you, you go." The yard keeper gave him an attentive look, cast his eyes about and turned on his heel to go. "I think you're quite ill, aren't you?" Nastasia observed, not taking her eyes off him. The yard keeper also turned his head round for a moment. "He's had a fever since yesterday," she added. He made no reply and continued to hold the document without unsealing it. "Now don't you get up," Nastasia went on, moved to pity, and seeing that he was lowering his legs off the sofa. "If you're ill, don't go. There's no hurry. What's that in your hand?" He looked. In his right hand he was holding the pared off bits of trouser end, the sock, and the remnants of the lining he'd torn out of his pocket. Yes, he'd slept with them like that. Thinking about this later on, he remembered that, half regaining consciousness in his fever, he'd squeezed all these things in his hand as tightly as he could and then fallen back to sleep again. "Look at him! Been out rag collecting. Now he sleeps with his rags as though they were treasure." Nastasia went off into fits of her morbidly nervous laughter. In a flash, he shoved everything under the overcoat and fixed his coat intently with his gaze. Even though he was very far from being able to think coherently at that moment, he nevertheless sensed that this was not the way people behave with someone who's about to be arrested. But the police? "What about some tea? Do you want some? I'll bring it for you. There's still some left." "No, I shall go. I'll go there right now," he muttered, getting to his feet. "You don't look to me as though you should get downstairs." "I'll go." "It's up to you." She followed the yard keeper out of the room. Immediately he rushed to the light in order to examine the sock and the trouser ends. "There are some stains, but they're not very noticeable. The blood's all covered in dirt and grime. It's got discoloured. If one didn't know in advance, one would never see it. That means that Nastasia can't have noticed anything. She was too far away. Thank God." And then with trepidation he broke the seal on the summons and began to read it. It took him a long, long time to do so, and at last he understood. It was an ordinary summons from the local police authority, requesting him to report to the district superintendent's bureau that very same morning at 9:30. When has this ever happened before? I never have any dealings with the police, and why today all of a sudden? He thought, in tormented wonderment. Oh, Lord, let it be over quickly. And he nearly dropped to his knees in order to pray, but then burst out laughing, not at the notion of praying, but at himself. He quickly began to dress. If the game's up, it's up, and there's nothing I can do about it. Why don't I put the sock on? He thought suddenly. I'll get even more dirt on it that way, and the marks will disappear. As soon as he put it on, however, he tore it off again in revulsion and horror. But having done so, he remembered that he had no others, and he picked it up and put it back on. Burst out laughing once more. This is the way it is in storybooks. It's all relative, all just for form's sake, he thought fleetingly, in some remote periphery of his mind, and he trembled in every limb. I mean, look, I put it on. That's what it's come to. I put it on. His laughter was, however, instantly replaced by despair. No, I'm not strong enough, he thought. His legs were trembling. With terror, he muttered to himself. His head was spinning and aching with fever. It's a ruse. They're using cunning in order to lure me there, and then they'll knock me for 6, he went on to himself, as he started to go downstairs. The worst of it is, I'm almost delirious. I may go and say something stupid. As he was going downstairs, he remembered that he had left all the gold objects in the hole behind the wallpaper. They may easily make a search of the place while I'm gone, he reflected, and came to a halt. But he was suddenly overcome by such despair, and by such cynicism with regard to his own downfall, if one might use such an expression, that he waved his hand in impatience and continued his descent. Oh, just let it be over quickly. Outside, the heat was once again unbearable. Not a single drop of rain all these days. Again the dust, brick and lime, again the stench from the little shops and drinking dens, again at every moment the drunks, the Finnish peddlers and the cabs that were practically falling to bits. The sun was glaring brightly into his eyes, making them hurt, and his head had begun to go round with a will, the usual sensation of a person in a fever who suddenly comes out to the street on a bright sunny day. When he reached the turning into yesterday's street, he glanced along it in the agony of anxiety to that house, and immediately looked away. If they ask me about it, I may tell them, he thought, as he approached the building that housed the bureau. The bureau was only about a quarter of a verst from where he lived. It had recently been transferred to new quarters on the 4th floor of a new building. He had once been briefly in the old quarters, but that had been a very long time ago. As he walked in through the entranceway, he saw a staircase to the right, down which a muzhik was coming with a book in his hand. "That'll be a yard keeper. That means the bureau's up there," and began to climb the staircase on the off chance that this was the right one. He didn't want to have to ask anyone the way. "I shall go in, get down on my knees, and tell them everything," he thought, as he went on up to the 4th floor. The staircase was small, narrow, steep, and awash with dirty water. All the doors of all the kitchens of all the apartments on all 4 floors were open to the staircase and remained so all day. This produced a terrible airless heat. Coming up and down the stairs were yard keepers with house books under their arms, police clerks and various tradespeople of both sexes, the callers. The door into the bureau itself was also open wide. He went in and halted in the vestibule. Some muzhiks were standing around there waiting. And here too the airless heat was extreme, and in addition, from the newly decorated rooms, there was a nauseating stink of paint that had not yet dried, and had been ground in rotten drying oil. Having waited for a bit, he decided to move on into the next room. All the rooms were tiny and low-ceilinged. A terrible impatience kept drawing him further and further. No one paid any attention to him. In the second room some scribes sat copying, dressed only slightly better than he was himself. A strange-looking bunch. He turned to one of them. "What do you want?" He held up the summons he had received from the bureau. "Are you a student?" asked the scribe, glancing at the summons. "Yes, an ex-student." The scribe let his eyes pass over him, but without a flicker of curiosity. He was an extremely rumpled-looking man with some fixed idea in his gaze. It's no good asking him, because he couldn't care less, Raskolnikov thought. "Go in there and see the clerk," said the scribe, pointing ahead to the very furthest room. He went into this room, the 4th in sequence, which was cramped and full to overflowing with members of the public, people dressed slightly better than those in the other rooms. Among these callers were 2 ladies. One was in mourning, dressed in widow's weeds. She sat on the other side of the clerk's desk facing him, while she wrote down something he was dictating to her. The other lady, who was very plump and had reddish-purple, blotched complexion, a stately woman, most opulently attired, with a brooch at her bosom, the size of a saucer, stood to one side and was waiting for something. Raskolnikov thrust his summons towards the clerk. The clerk gave it a fleeting glance, told him to wait, and continued his business with the lady in mourning. His breath came more easily now. "It's definitely not about the other." Gradually his spirits began to revive, and he inwardly exhorted himself to have courage and gather his thoughts. The slightest stupid mistake, the slightest little indiscretion, and I may easily give myself away entirely. "It's a pity there's no air in here," he went on. "It's so stuffy. My head is getting even dizzier, and my mind too." He was experiencing a terrible sense of disorder that affected his whole being. He was afraid he'd lose control of himself. He tried to fasten his attention on something, think about something, anything at all, that had nothing whatever to do with all this, but failed completely. The clerk, on the other hand, he found intensely interesting. He wanted to guess everything by his features, penetrate the very heart of his being. This clerk was a young man of about 22. He had a swarthy, mobile physiognomy that made him look older than his years, and he was fashionably, even foppishly dressed. His hair was parted at the back of his head, thoroughly combed and pomaded, and there were a large number of rings and signets on his white scrubbed fingers, and gold chains on his waistcoat. With one of the foreign visitors to his room, he had even exchanged a word or two in French, quite passably at that. "Louisa Ivanovna, you'd better sit down," he said cursorily to the overdressed reddish-purple lady, who was still standing as if she didn't dare to sit down, even though there was a chair beside her. "Ich danke," she said quietly, lowering herself onto the chair with a silken swishing sound. Her light blue dress, with all its white lace trimming, spread around the chair like a balloon, taking up practically half the room. There was a smell of perfume. But the lady was plainly abashed at taking up half the room and at smelling so strongly of perfume, in spite of the fact that she was smiling in a way that was timorous and brazen at the same time, though with obvious uneasiness. The lady in mourning finally completed what she was doing and began to get up. And suddenly, with a certain amount of clamour, an officer made an extremely dashing entrance, swinging his shoulders in a peculiar way with every step he took, threw his cap with its cockade onto the desk, and sat down in one of the armchairs. The opulent lady fairly leapt up from her chair at the sight of him, began to drop curtsies with a singular enthusiasm, but the officer paid her not the slightest attention, and she didn't dare to sit down again while he was there. He was a lieutenant, the superintendent's auxiliary, with a horizontal reddish moustache that jutted out in both directions, and a face that was extremely small-featured and expressed nothing much except a certain insolence. He gave Raskolnikov a sidelong glance that was tinged with indignation. Those clothes he was wearing were really in a shocking state. Yet, in spite of his humiliating position, his bearing was not in keeping with his clothes. Raskolnikov, caught off his guard, had cast too long and direct a look at him, so that the officer had taken offence. "What's your business?" he bawled, doubtless astonished that a ragged fellow such as this had not been reduced to nothing by his lightning-charged gaze. "I was told to report. I got a summons," Raskolnikov managed to reply. "It's about the extraction proceedings for the recovery of funds from him, from the student," the clerk said, beginning to bustle about as he stopped working on his document. "Here," and he threw Raskolnikov the book, pointing out the relevant place. "Read that." "Funds? What funds?" thought Raskolnikov. "But that means it's definitely not about the other." And he shuddered with relief. He suddenly began to feel terribly, inexpressibly light-hearted. All his cares seemed to lift from his shoulders. "And what time did it say you were supposed to be here, my dear sir?" the lieutenant bawled, for some unknown reason growing more and more outraged. "You're down for 9, but it's after 11 now." "I was only served the summons a quarter of an hour ago," Raskolnikov answered loudly over his shoulder, suddenly also losing his temper in spite of himself, and even taking a certain pleasure in it. "It ought to be enough that I've come at all, since I'm ill and have a fever." "Be so good as not to shout, will you?" "I'm not shouting. I'm talking quite softly. It's you who are shouting at me, but I'm a student and won't allow people to shout at me." This made the assistant so livid that for a moment he was incapable of speech, and all that happened was that some spittle came flying from his lips. He leapt up from his seat. "Be silent! You're in a government bureau. None of your rudeness, sir." "You're in a government bureau too," Raskolnikov exclaimed, "and what's more, by shouting and by smoking that cigarette, you're letting us all down." Having said this, he felt an inexpressible sense of enjoyment. The clerk looked at them with a smile. The quick-tempered lieutenant was visibly taken aback. "That's not your concern, sir," he cried at last, in an unnaturally loud voice. "And now kindly be so good as to make the statement that's required of you. Show him, Alexander Grigoryevitch. We've had complaints about you. You don't pay your bills. Crikey, a fine upstanding young fellow you are, and no mistake." But Raskolnikov was no longer listening. He had greedily snatched up the document in search of a speedy resolution of the problem. He read it through at once, and then a second time, but understood nothing. "What is this?" he asked the clerk. "It's a document demanding funds from you in acknowledgment of debt, an extraction note. You must either pay it in full with all due penalties, including those for late payment, or else file a written statement saying when you will be able to pay it. And you must also undertake not to leave the capital, nor to sell or conceal any property you may possess. The creditor, on the other hand, is empowered to sell your property and to take proceedings against you in accordance with the law." "But I don't owe anyone anything." "Well, that's no concern of ours. All we know is we've received an overdue and legally protested acknowledgment of debt in the sum of 115 roubles, issued by you some 9 months ago to the collegiate assessor's widow Zarnitstrina, and discharged by her in transfer to the court councillor Chebarov. And we've called you in so you can file your statement." "But I mean, she's my landlady." "So what if she is?" The clerk smiled at him with a look of pitying condescension, which was accompanied by one of a certain triumph, as if this were some new conscript who had only just begun to face life under fire, and as though to say, "Well, what do you feel like now?" But what did he care now about acknowledgments of debt and extraction notes? Did all that warrant even a moment's anxiety now, even a moment's attention? He stood, read, listened, answered, even asked questions himself, but did it all mechanically. An exultant sense of self-preservation, of having escaped from the danger that had been crushing him, that was what filled the whole of his being at that moment. And it contained no predictions, no analysis, no plans or guesses about the future, no doubts and no questions. It was a moment of total, spontaneous, purely animal joy. But at that very moment there occurred in the bureau something akin to thunder and lightning. The lieutenant, still in a state of complete shock from the lack of respect he had been shown, burning with anger, evidently wishing to bolster up his damaged self-esteem, descended like all the gods of war upon the unfortunate opulent lady, who had been looking at him ever since he had come in, with a thoroughly stupid smile. "As for you, madam, this, that, and the other," he suddenly shouted at the top of his voice. The lady in mourning had gone by this time. "What was happening at your place last night, eh? More shameful goings-on involving the whole street in your debauchery? More fighting and drunkenness? Got your sights on the House of Correction, have you? Look here, I've warned you, I've told you a dozen times this'll happen once, too often, and now you've gone and done it again. Again, madam, this, that, and the other." The document actually fell out of Raskolnikov's hands, and he stared wildly at the opulent lady who had been given such an unceremonious dressing down. Soon, however, he had fathomed what all this was about, and immediately the whole episode took on a positively appealing aspect. He listened with enjoyment, and even felt like laughing. All his nerves were dancing on edge. "Ilya Petrovitch," the clerk began with a note of concern in his voice, but thought the better of it, and decided to wait until the storm had passed, as there was no way to restrain the lieutenant when he was in a rage except by force, something he knew from personal experience. As for the opulent lady, at first the thunder and lightning nearly made her jump out of her skin. But it was a strange thing. The more numerous the oaths became, and the greater their violence, the more affectionate and charming was the smile that she turned upon the fierce lieutenant. She minced about on the spot, and kept up a ceaseless curtsying, waiting with impatience to be allowed to put her side of the argument, until her chance finally came. "There was no trouble or fighting on my premises, Herr Captain," she suddenly rattled out in a voice that was like the scattering of dried peas in a strong German accent, though her Russian was fluent. "And there was no scandal, but they were drunk when they arrived. It's all there is to it, Herr Captain. And I'm not to blame. I keep a decent house, Herr Captain, and a decent way of life, and I've always avoided any kind of scandal. but they arrived completely drunk, and then they asked for another 3 bottles, and then one of them put his legs up and started to play the piano with his foot. And that is not the way to behave in a decent house. And he ruined the piano, ganz, and completely. No manners. I told him so. But he picked up a bottle and began poking everyone in the back with it. At that point I called the yard keeper quick, and Carl came. He took hold of Carl and gave him a black eye, and also one to Henrietta, and he hit me in the face 5 times. I was so unmannered in a decent house, Herr Captain, and I shouted, and he opened the window onto the canal, and he stood there squealing out of it like a little pig, and that was disgraceful. How could he do it? Squeal like a little pig out the window for everyone in the street to hear. Pui, pui, pui. And Carl put him back from the window with his coattails and tore sein Rock in zwei. That's true, Herr Captain. And then he shouted, "Man Fuß, fine, the 515 roubles pay," and I, Herr Captain, paid him 5 roubles for sein Rock. Oh, what a rude guest he was, Herr Captain, and what a scandal he did make. He said, "I'll have a big lampoon about you gedruckt, for I can write whatever I like about you. I get it in all the newspapers." He's a writer, then? Yes, Herr Captain. And what a rude guest, Herr Captain, in a decent house. All right, that's enough. I've told you. Ilya Petrovich, the clerk said again, meaningfully. The lieutenant gave him a quick glance. The clerk nodded his head slightly. "So that my most estimable Lavisa Ivanovna is the long and the short of my tale, and this is the last time I'm going to tell you it," the lieutenant went on. "If there's so much as one more scandalous scene in that decent house of yours, I shall give you the 200 treatment, as they say in polite circles. Do you hear? So, a literary gentleman, one of those writers, got 5 roubles in a decent house for a coat tail, did he?" "There's one of them standing right there," he said, throwing a contemptuous glance in Raskolnikov's direction. "There was some trouble with another of them in an inn the day before yesterday. The fellow hadn't eaten a meal, but didn't want to pay for it. 'I'll write a lampoon about you if you try to make me,' he said. And there was yet another on board a steamer last week who flung the vilest abuse at this distinguished family of a state councillor, wife and daughter. One was kicked out of a pastry shop the other day. That's the sort of fellows they are, those writers, those literary gents, those students, those messengers of doom. Pah! You be off. I'll be popping in to see you myself one of these days. Then you better watch out, d'ye hear?" With hurried good manners, Louisa Ivanovna began to curtsy in all directions, backing towards the door as she did so. But in the doorway her posterior collided with a handsome officer who had a fresh, open face and a magnificent pair of the very thickest blonde side whiskers. This was none other than Nikodim Fomitch himself, the district superintendent. Louisa Ivanovna made haste to curtsy very nearly to the floor. Then, jumping up and down with her quick little steps, she rushed out of the bureau. "More crashing and banging, more thunder and lightning, more tornadoes and hurricanes," Nikodim Fomitch said to Ilya Petrovich in an amiable, friendly tone of voice. "They've upset you again. You've lost your temper again. I could hear it from the stairs." "So what?" Ilya Petrovich said with well-bred casualness. Indeed, it sounded more like "so what" than "so what," as he took some documents over to the other desk, waggling his shoulders picturesquely as he did so, one waggle to each step. "Here we are, sir, if you'll be so good as to take a look. A certain Mr. Writer, alias student, X that is, doesn't pay his bills, been fobbing people off with promissory notes, won't quit his lodgings. We've had a ceaseless flow of complaints about him, yet he nearly filed a claim against me for lighting a cigarette in front of him. He acts like a mean bastard, and if you'll be so good as to take a look at him now, sir, here he is, being his most attractive self. Poverty's no crime, old chap. Now, what's the trouble? I bet it's that gunpowder temper of yours. You must have taken offence. You must have been insulted by something he said, and not been able to restrain yourself," Nikodim Fomitch went on, turning to Raskolnikov politely. but there was really no need for you to. He's a most extraordinarily well-bred chap, but powder. He catches fire, sizzles up, burns away in a flash, and that's it. It's all over, and as a result he has a heart of pure gold. That's what they used to call him in that regiment of his, Lieutenant Gunpowder. And what a regiment it was! Ilya Petrovitch exclaimed, thoroughly pleased at having his vanity tickled in such an agreeable manner, but still sulking nevertheless. Raskolnikov suddenly felt like being very nice to them. "Look, for heaven's sake, Captain," he began in a thoroughly familiar tone of voice, suddenly turning to Nikodim Fomitch. "Put yourself in my position. I'm even prepared to apologise to him if I've said something wrong. I'm a poor, sick student, oppressed," he actually said oppressed, "by poverty. The reason I'm an ex-student is that I can't support myself now, but I'll be getting some money. I have a mother and a sister in the province, and they'll be sending me some money, and I'll pay up. My landlady's a kind-hearted woman, but she got so angry at me for having lost my private teaching and being more than 3 months behind with the rent, they doesn't even send any meals up to me now, and I really don't know what this promissory note is that you keep talking about. Here she is demanding payment by means of an acknowledgement of debt, and how can I possibly make it? You judge for yourselves." "Well, I'm afraid that's not our business," the clerk observed. Quite. I couldn't agree with you more, but please let me explain," Raskolnikov said, taking the initiative and addressing his words not to the clerk, but still to Nikodim Fomitch, though also endeavouring with all his might to include Ilya Petrovitch as well, in spite of the fact that the latter was pretending to rummage about in his papers, scornfully ignoring him. "Let me explain my side of the argument. I've been living in her place for about 3 years now, ever since I arrived from the provinces, and some time ago, oh well, why shouldn't I make a clean breast of it? Right from the time I moved in, I promised her that I'd marry her daughter. It was only a promise by word of mouth, and I was completely free to change my mind. She was just a girl. I actually found her rather appealing, though I wasn't in love with her. In short, you could put it down to my youth. That is, I mean to say, my landlady let me have a lot of credit, and I also led a life that was rather... I was very frivolous." "We're not at all interested in matters of an intimate nature, sir, and anyway, we haven't the time," Ilya Petrovitch said, starting to interrupt him rudely and with triumph. But Raskolnikov heatedly prevented him from going any further, even though he was suddenly finding it very difficult to speak. Quite, but just let me tell you what happened, even though I agree with you that it's not really relevant. But a year ago this girl died of typhus. I remained as a lodger as before, and when my landlady moved into her present apartment she told me quite cordially, that she had every confidence in me, but please, would I give her an acknowledgement of debt, the one you see before you now, in the sum of 115 roubles, this being all she considered I owed her. I must point out, sirs, that she specifically said that as long as I gave her that document, she'd let me have as much credit as I liked. And as far as she was concerned, never, those were her very words, would she turn that document to account until I was able to pay her. And yet now, when I've lost my private teaching and have nothing to eat, she serves me with an extraction note. What more can I say?" "All these sentimental details are no concern of ours, my dear sir," said Ilya Petrovitch, brazenly cutting him short. "You must file a statement and sign a treaty of obligation, but as for the fact of your falling in love and all the rest of these tragic episodes, they are quite simply no business of ours." "Now you're being a bit hard," muttered Nikodim Fomitch, sitting down at his desk and also beginning to do some signing. He was feeling a little embarrassed. "Well, get on with it," the clerk said to Raskolnikov. "What do you want me to write?" the latter asked, somehow especially coarsely. "I'll dictate it to you." Raskolnikov had a feeling that the clerk had started to treat him with even less respect and even greater contempt since he had made his confession. It was a strange thing. He suddenly felt he really didn't give a damn about what anybody thought, and this change took place in the interval of a single flash, a single moment. If he had taken the trouble to do a little thinking, he would doubtless have been astonished that he could have spoken to these men the way he'd just done, even bothering them with his emotions, wherever those emotions had come from. On the other hand, if now the room was suddenly to have filled up, not with policemen, but with his dearest and most cherished friends, he'd not have had a single kind word to say to them, so desolate had his heart become. His soul had suddenly and consciously been affected by a gloomy sense of alienation, compounded with one of an agonizing, infinite solitariness. It was not the cheapness of his emotional outpourings to Ilya Petrovitch, nor the cheapness of the lieutenant's triumph at his expense, that had suddenly capsized his mood. But what did he care now about his own baseness, about all these sensitive amours-propres, these lieutenants, German ladies, extraction notes, bureau, so on and so forth? Even if he had been sentenced to be burned alive just then, he had not have moved a muscle, nor for that matter paid much attention. Something was happening to him that was completely unfamiliar to him, something new, unannounced and unprecedented. Less did he understand than clearly sense with all the power of sensation that not only was it impossible for him to address these people in the superintendent's bureau with the sentimental expansiveness he had lately employed, he could address them on no other terms either, and even if they had all been his very own brothers and sisters and not police lieutenants at all, even then he would have had absolutely no reason to address them about any circumstances of his life that he could possibly imagine. Never until that moment had he experienced such a strange and terrible sensation. And what made it all the more tormentingly painful was that it was more a sensation than a perception, an idea, a direct, unmediated sensation, the most tormenting of all the sensations he had ever experienced in the whole of his life. The clerk began to dictate a statement to him in the form that was usually adopted in such cases, which said that he was unable to pay, that he would pay by such and such a date, that he did not leave town or sell any property he owned or give it to anyone, etc., etc. "But I say you can't write properly. The pen's falling out of your hand," the clerk observed with curiosity, peering at Raskolnikov. "Are you all right?" "No, I feel dizzy. Continue." "There isn't any more. That's it. Please sign it." The clerk took the document away and busied himself with some others. Raskolnikov handed back the pen, but instead of getting up and leaving, he put both elbows on the desk and clutched his head with his hands. He felt as though a nail were being driven through its crown. A strange idea suddenly came to him, that of standing up right now, going over to Nikidim Fomitch, and telling him everything that had happened the day before, down to the last detail, and then taking him to his lodgings and showing him the gold objects in the corner inside the hole. The urge was so strong that he actually stood up in order to put it into action. "Shouldn't I think about it for a moment?" flashed through his head. "No, it's better to do it without thinking and get it off my chest." But suddenly he stood still like one thunderstruck. Nikidim Fomitch was talking heatedly to Ilya Petrovitch, and he could hear what they were saying. "It's impossible. They'll both be set free. For one thing, none of it makes any sense. Judge for yourself. Why would they go and fetch the yard keeper if they were the ones who had done it? In order to give themselves up, or what? Or because they were trying to be clever? Why, that would be a bit too clever. And then there's that fact that the student, Pestryakov, was seen by both the yard keepers and an artisan woman in the entranceway as he was going in. He was with 3 companions, and he left them outside while he went in and asked the yard keepers if there was any accommodation to be had, though his companions saw him doing it. Well, would he have been asking about accommodation if he had had a plan like that in his head? And as for Koch, well, he spent half an hour talking to the silversmith first, and went up to the old woman's apartment at exactly 7:45. Now figure it out from that. Well, if you don't mind my saying so, sir, how is it that there's the same contradiction in both their statements? They say that they knocked and that the door was closed, and yet 3 minutes later, when they came back up again with the yard keeper, the door turned out to be open. That's precisely it. There's no doubt at all that the murderer was in the apartment and had bolted himself inside. And there's no doubt either that he'd have been caught there if only Koch hadn't been stupid and gone to look for the yard keeper as well. Our fellow must have taken advantage of that breathing space in order to get down the stairs and somehow sneak past them. Koch eagerly swears that if he had stayed there, the fellow would have jumped out at him and killed him with an axe. He's going to offer up Thanksgiving prayers, Russian style. And none caught sight of the murderer? How could they in such a place? That building's a Noah's Ark, the clerk who had been listening from his seat observed. The man's right, you know. The matter's perfectly clear, Nikodym Fomitch said heatedly. No, on the contrary, the matter's most unclear, Ilya Petrovitch affirmed. Raskolnikov picked up his hat and walked towards the door, but did not get that far. When he recovered consciousness, he realised he was sitting on a chair, being supported by a man on his right, that there was another man on his left holding a yellow tumbler full of yellow water, and that Nikodym Fomitch was standing before him, staring at him fixedly. He had risen from his seat. "What's this? Are you ill?" Nikodym Fomitch asked, rather sharply. When he was signing, he could hardly get the pen across the paper, the clerk commented, sitting down in his place and busying himself with his papers again. "How long have you been ill?" Ilya Petrovitch shouted from his seat, also in the process of sorting through his papers. He had, needless to say, also been examining the sick man as he had lain unconscious, but had moved away the instant he'd come to. "Since yesterday," Raskolnikov muttered in reply. "Did you go out yesterday?" "Yes." "Even though you were ill?" "Even though I was ill." "At what time?" "About 8 p.m. "Where did you go, may I ask?" "Down the street." "You don't waste words, do you?" Raskolnikov had delivered his reply as abruptly, jerkily, pale as a square of white cloth, without letting his black, inflamed eyes fall away from Ilya Petrovitch's gaze. "He can hardly stay standing. Yet you—" Nikodym Fomitch began to protest. "It's quite all right," Ilya Petrovitch said in an odd tone of voice. Nikodym Fomitch was on the point of adding something, but glancing at the clerk, who was now looking fixedly at him too, changed his mind. Everyone suddenly fell silent. There was something strange about it. "All right, sir," Ilya Petrovitch said, winding up the proceedings. "We won't detain you any further." Raskolnikov went out. After he had left, he distinctly heard a sudden burst of heated conversation, in which the questioning voices of Nikodym Fomitch was raised high above all the others. On reaching the street, he came wide awake. A search! There'll be a search without delay, he said to himself, hurrying to get back to his room. The crafty devils, they suspect. Again he was seized by his former sense of horror, all over, from top to toe.